Hi, and welcome to RBP on JSB. I'm violinist Rachel Barton Pine, and today we're going to be discussing the second movement of Bach's Sonata No. 1 in G minor, the Fuga, or I'll just call it fugue, because saying Fuga again and again is going to feel a little silly. By the way, if you want to hear some thoughts about general issues that pertain to all of the Bach Sonatas and Partitas, be sure to watch the overview episode. So a fugue, of course, is where there's a little bit of musical material, generally called the subject, or rather than the theme. I guess it's the topic of discussion, so it's the subject of this musical exposition. And that subject gets played by multiple voices, trading it back and forth. Think about if three people were to all converse simultaneously. It wouldn't be very effective, but in music it works wonderfully well. But it is very dense, and so I really recommend playing each voice separately. So you might start with, your middle voice here. And then you might play your lower voice. And then, of course, your top voice, which comes in the third measure. And just going through the whole movement like that, just to make sure that then when you play, especially when it gets into all of these triple stops, etc., that making sure that what you're listening for with the that it still sounds nice even when all of that other stuff is cluttering it up. And by the way, play it through listening for the top voice, play it through listening for the middle voice, play it through listening for the bottom voice, depending on what little section you're breaking down in that day's practicing or that moment's practicing. And play the same thing once, listening for this voice, again listening for that voice. Well, let's go back to measure 3. Let's make sure that the top voice sounds beautiful, that it doesn't sound all clunky now that I add the chords. And let's listen for the chords themselves, particularly the lower voice, to make sure they don't lose any of those notes. Sorry. All right, because it's easy to accidentally fluff a note and not realize that you didn't play it in a ringing way because you were just listening for the top voice or something like that, or to be listening for the bottom voice because it has the subject and then missing that you fluffed the top voice. So like this guy, you want to but make sure all sound good also. So your ear is going in one place and then another, always playing everything twice, listening for the bottom and the top. There's a really interesting series out now called Bach for Two, which is BACHFOR numeral 2, which you can find online, and it's the 3 fugues thus far. And what the author has done is actually made them into 2 violin duets. Now, I guess you could have made them into trios or quartets, but still, just having it in 2 separate violin parts and then playing it with a friend, you actually hear things. Well, this happened to me. I heard things that I really had never quite heard before, despite analyzing this piece, practicing it for years, practicing it for I don't even know how many lifetime hours, so that was pretty fun. So there's places where Bach uses only 2 voices for a while. Of course, the section at measure 14. Then this one. And if you start this up bow, then you either have to take another down bow or end up on an up bow here. Of course, the question is whether to hold this note. A lot of Bach's printed note lengths are just meant to be implied. You can't physically, these aren't going to be 4/8. They wouldn't be legato anyway, so it's short eighths anyway, but still, it's eighths that are with 16th notes, so each one can only be a 16th worth. This one, the question is whether we should play just an eighth worth and think the dotted quarter, because really the fact that it has a tie is just the fact that it goes over a bar line. If he had written it as a dotted quarter, would we have been as likely to slur it? It's a psychological thing, I wonder. Anyhow, I did it that way for many years, but then I realized I was kind of missing that nice dissonance of the major seventh. So then I was doing this kind of a thing, almost like the third movement of the second sonata. Right, I was going, but at this speed, it's a little funny sounding. So I didn't like that solution either. So now I have gone back full circle. I do slur it, which is how I originally did it at age 10 or whatever. And of course the bottom line would not have been slurred. But you have to make compromises in one direction or another. And right now I'm enjoying hearing the dissonance. I do start the second measure down bow, which I think is a perfectly valid solution. You have to make an inside-out measure shape, but then you can catch that on a down bow, and then same thing. So going on from there, in measure 18, we have a half bar dialogue, the lower voice, and it's kind of a build, so you probably want to start softer. And then an unresolved seventh, then the upper voice has her say, then an unresolved second, and then the lower voice. So I always think of this as two little kids that are arguing, and then the mom comes in and says, "Hey, cut it out, you guys." There are all kinds of fun things you can do, thinking of the story of the movement as you go along. But of course, you could just think of it purely instrumentally. I think there's a lot of influence of the organ in this particular movement, and so I think of this as, you know, two of the flute stops. And then maybe the pedals come in here. But you really think of that low, deep voice being added right there. Measure 30 and the corresponding spot later on towards the end of the movement in measure 75, it's really tricky to not lose the lower voices because you've got half of them starting on up bow and there's no help for it because of the slurs that Bach indicates. So really make sure you listen for those guys. And make sure that you don't think of the beat as starting until you've gotten all the way to the top. Sometimes you need a little time to get around to there. But you know, take all the time you need, but then the beat doesn't start till you arrive on the treble note. So actually a lot of these bass notes are slightly before the beat, but they all need to ring. There's one interesting moment in measure 53. It's the only time where you hear the subject, but it's missing a note. And the question is, did Bach intend to leave this note out? There's actually a transcription for, I think, lute of this movement where that note has been put in. So what I'm talking about is... Right? So what Bach wrote is... So that second, this note, is missing. Now you could actually argue, and I indeed did it this way for many, many years, that the beginning of the bar is a gesture, da 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 da, and then the next note, dum ba da da dum bum bum, going on into the cadence. After we have our middle voice in measure 52, so then kind of phrasing away from there, and then here, leading to the coda. Right, so that totally works, and that's the most kosher thing to do because that's what's in the manuscript. But lately, I've felt a little rebellious, and I kind of like having that subject actually appear. So I add that note in. But maybe don't do that for a competition. Once you're a performing professional, you can do whatever you want, and if you like that note, well then there's nobody stopping you. Then who knows? I mean, like I said, it is in another version of this same movement for another instrument, so it wasn't an illegal thing to think of. Another influence of the organ that's really fun in this movement is the pedal points. In other words, long held sustained notes that go for a while under a lot of other notes. Now, physically on the violin we can't do that, but we can do that in our imaginations, and somehow if we think something hard enough, magically our audience will think the same thing as us. It's really uncanny. So the first one is starting in measure 69. You can hear all these Ds. Well, those, of course, you would never play it that way. I was just making sure you could hear those Ds. Now, we have to hear those Ds just going the whole way. The most important thing is, even though it's only a 16th note, stroke it with the bow in such a way that it rings and rings and rings. So it really is ringing for the whole half bar until you stroke it again. And making sure that all of them, have the same approach, even as you're building the line and so on, that you don't accidentally fluff one or something, because that would destroy the whole effect. They're almost more important than the other stuff going on, which is just the harmonic progression leading back to the subject. And actually, there's a weird subject, because it should be, but instead he just has. But I guess it's not really the subject because he doesn't do that. I don't know. It's really interesting to see how he constructed this thing. You could just spend hours staring at it. It's much more fun than Sudoku. Okay, so then the other pedal point big spot is measure 87, the coda, where he has the low Gs. Then a moving line. And then this long one, D, that's hard to do. And then this D, it's still going. Finally, the D. So you can see if it was an organ, they'd just be holding that D the whole time. So how do we, kind of emulate that? Obviously, these guys, we have to make them ring. Don't take a ton of time, because that's defeating the purpose. In fact, the more time you take on that held note, the fewer notes it's going to hold during, because it's going to fade sooner into your next notes. Hold it long enough, but not so it distorts the rhythm. But just as long as you're aware that those are your pedals and not just... If you just play it like it's one of the 16th notes, we won't hear it. So just stroke it differently. As opposed to... You see? I'm not taking a ton of time, but it's the way that I make that note ring. And then this one... In a way, it's just magic. You just have to be thinking that D, and then also, of course, grouping the notes together as if they're all one cascade of stuff going on over the D. So it's not... So it's not a lot of individual meaning in all of these beats, but just a whole kind of cadenza. And then here's one that's really a cascade. And then you can just jump. If you listen to some of the actual Bach fugues for organ, from the toccatas and fugues, and actually even though it's a 20th century romantic-ish kind of thing to do, but listen to Stokowski's version of the D minor fugue, the one that's in Fantasia. Just listening to that, the grandeur, really does give you some inspiration for playing moments like this in this particular fugue. Now the thing you want to do that you probably don't want to do the romantic version is the old-fashioned hook in the first measure. The problem with that is it makes the beats be too equal. Dun, 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 dun. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's really unmusical. What you want to do is, like, if you were singing it, the phrase would have some shape. Bum, 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 ba, da, da, dum, bum, bum. You wouldn't go da, 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 dum, dum, dum. And you can do that throughout the whole fugue, regardless of triple stops or anything else. Da, 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 dum, 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 every time the subject appears. And so it's so much nicer to do it with separate bows. Occasionally, because of 3-note chords, I'll have to take a separate down. Let's see a good example of that. A good example of that is measure 21. I really wouldn't. If you do it totally as it comes, then you're all backwards for this thing. But if you can do an up, which is another option. But, just take another down. It's kind of hooking that down bow in, but not in a thing with the 16ths, which that ends up feeling very stilted. So, and as we discussed earlier, you might want to start some of them down bow. I used to start all 3 of these up bow. Then another up. Perfectly fine too, but now I find that there's a little bit of freedom, even though I'm backwards for the phrasing. It kind of does help me make a longer musical line within the small little phraselets. Speaking of longer musical lines, when you get to passages of 16th notes, like measure 7, you want to make sure that it doesn't sound like a run-on sentence. Da 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 da. The question is always, how are those notes grouped together? If you have 8 notes, it might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. You get the point. Notes are either going away or going towards, and the question is, what is the phrase shape within those groups of notes? To me, the second half of 9 is 5 plus 3, so... and then a little pickup. And also measure 8 phrases off after the first note. And then but there's lots of different solutions. Just make sure you're doing something and not turning it into a perpetual motion. Right, because that's totally unmusical. There's also some fun and interesting slurs in Bach's 16th notes. Measure 51, he has all these little 2-note slurs that are across the beats, almost giving you a feeling of syncopation. And you really should show them. Make sure you don't glue it together so much that we don't notice them. Then that's not as interesting as it could be, but make the slurs speak. A ever so slight amount of space between them. Right? And then the best one of all is this super cool spot at measure 79 where he's like 1, 2, 3, da 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 da. It's like, moment of jazz or something over there. So that's a really fun one to really bring out the starts of the slurs. If you keep it to the 4-beat feel and just make the slurs adhere to that, right? I mean, not with that much emphasis, but then you lose the potential of that measure to do something different than that. So then it's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, dun, and then back to your normal dun 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 da 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 dun, etc. Anyways, just something to think about. Then, of course, Bach's slurs don't work in measure 92. He has single note, 4-note slur, 3-note slur, and then you're not going to play this up. Oh, no way. So you could either hook the slurs here, hook them here, neither of which feels great. I actually split the first slur, taking a second down, which I know I'm not doing exactly what's in the manuscript, but you've got to do something to fix that problem because it just doesn't quite work the way that Bach wrote it. Speaking of what he wrote in the manuscript, the end of measure 63 looks like it could be over 4 notes, but if you look at beat 2, it's clearly such a bigger slur over 4 notes that to do the second one also over 4 notes within the context of just that measure just doesn't make sense. Musically, people think, okay, so you've got, which is the equivalent of, but I think that's actually the exact argument for why you shouldn't do them the same, because variety was more valued than consistency in the Baroque era, and so doing something slightly different would have been more tasteful. It's just so much sweeter to do that little 2-note slur. But, look at the manuscript for yourself and make your own decisions, because your opinion might be different than somebody else's, and your opinion next year might be different from what it is today. We talked about phrasing the subject and phrasing 16th notes, but make sure that there's never anything that you don't phrase. Sometimes really dastardly spots like these multiple triple stops in a row between 21 and 22, it's really tempting to just worry about your fingers and forget about the music. But if you were singing it, dun, 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 of course you wouldn't go dun, 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 dun. That doesn't sound like anything, and yet somehow that's how we play it because we're already so distracted by just, executing it. So make sure that you think about what you want the phrase to be away from the violin, singing the music out loud, singing the music in your head, just looking at the music, hearing it in your ear, and then do that, even if it makes it a little bit harder because of all those tricky notes. So that even with the triple stops, you're still making that beautiful phrase. And then also make sure that you take plenty of time between sections. Fugues can go on and on and on and get so dense. It's really nice for the performer and the listener to have moments when you get to kind of catch your breath for a second. And so the cadences, measures 14, 24, 55, 64, and especially the big one at 87 before the coda at the end. All of these are moments where you can let the music resolve and then wait before going on. So let's do the first one, starting in 13. Well, that was actually a little too much time, but you get the point. The next one in 24. You really can take quite a bit of time because it feels so much nicer. I'd have to back up by a few more bars for you to really get the point, but better than just barreling on ahead. But let it finish itself, then lift the bow and just start the new section nicely. Perhaps the biggest mystery of this movement is what did Bach intend in measure 35? It seems like it should be arpeggiated, but he didn't write arpeggio like he did in the chaconne when it's supposed to be arpeggiated in those 2 spots. So what are we to do with that? Sometimes I think Bach left stuff off like cadential trills. There should clearly be one in measure 24. He didn't write one, also measure 54, but it would be bizarre not to do one. Hey, he didn't write one in 86 either. But yeah, you got to do all 3 of those or it's just like bare and strange. And everybody knew that you should do a cadential trill in 1720, so leaving one off in a way wasn't even leaving it off. It was like he knew you were going to do it, so why should he bother to write it down? So maybe he had the same idea with these arpeggios, like, of course it's supposed to be arpeggiated, why am I going to actually put that on the page, or he just forgot. But what happens if you play it straight? That works. But now here, we're playing the middle voice as 4/8, whereas it's written as a half, so that's a little funny. I don't think you would do, make the other halves into 8s. So the whole thing logically doesn't quite add up. So I think arpeggiating it is probably the best solution. Plus, frankly, sometimes when you can't think of these things from a historical or a logical perspective, you have to fall back on your ultimate argument, which is, which do I like better, or which sounds better? And frankly, going doesn't sound nearly as nice as Of course, each of us is our own personality, and I'm sure there's some artists out there who can really sell me on the non-arpeggiated version and make it sound awesome. But arpeggios are probably the safer and more easily beautiful way to go. Then, measure 38. What do we do there? It almost seems like an unwritten out version of the kind of stuff that's in the C major fugue from Sonata No. 3. Where he kind of has the two voice double stop and then the pedal note in between them. And you could certainly do that totally effectively with this whole section. Actually, that's how I first learned it back in the day. Or you could legitimately continue the same arpeggios, which is how I do it these days for, I don't have like a great reason for doing that. It's certainly allowed in terms of Baroque performance practice, but I right now happen to like that way better. But I very well might change my mind, in a year or 2 or 10. Who knows? What you have to ask yourself is not only what sounds best for that passage from 38 to 41, but also what are you doing in 35 to 37, and how do those two solutions connect well to each other? So some of the options, and unfortunately we can't ask Bach, so we just got to figure it out for ourselves. But whatever you do something that you like how it sounds and play it as beautifully as you can. Well, those are some of my thoughts about the G minor fugue. This is Rachel Barton Pine, and thanks for watching RBP on JSB.